Hey, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar where we're going to be breaking down the Salesforce Drift breach from the lens of an attacker. My name is Matt Mullins. I'm the head hacker and offensive security subject matter expert here at Reveal Security. And I am joined today by the illustrious Clint Kier. He's a security architect and also a senior instructor at Cyber. A little bit of Clint's background, I'll just throw out there, Clint, and obviously you can fill me in. His background spans law enforcement, intelligence, and of course, offensive security. Clint began his career as a federal agent involved in cybercrime operations, focused on cryptocurrency, and he then went on to manage cyber operations for the United States military, ultimately pivoting afterwards to the private sector, away from the government side, and focusing on application security and offensive security. After a number of years on the offensive side, Clint currently switched over and serves as a security architect who's focusing on building strong modern defenses to help organizations be more resilient to the attacks and strategies that he has implemented and executed through the course of his career. Clint, welcome.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here and quite the intro. Yes, coming from law enforcement and really enjoying the work that I did there, especially the dark web operations and getting more technical and saying, hey, maybe I want to do this full time. Really wanting to be a pen tester. So, I know some agents have written books on being bikers. I really wanted to be a hacker. So I got to live out my dream and do that. But yes, I like to look at both sides of the coin. So certainly now pivoting into more of the blue team thinking, although I will say, the hacker mindset is probably the more fun one.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you, man. It's been a cool career for me as well. So, um,
Yes, and I know we've worked together a bit, so it's good to be here and see you again.
yeah, yeah, likewise. It's always fun. So a few quick housekeeping notes just for the general audience. We're going to be here for 30 minutes roughly. I know that there was some conversation about some Q&A, so we're going to have some Q&A time at the very end. This is a Zoom session, so please use the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen to send any questions or any comments or anything like that. If you need, something answered, and we'll be happy to keep our eyes out for that. I've actually got it pulled up right now. And so, as you probably have kind of picked up, the format for today is more of a discussion and a conversation. We have some slides, as you can see on the screen, that we're going to be going through where we walk through each step of the attack. But really, it's going to be, Clint and I just kind of digging into, what happened, probably why it happened, and then kind of dig into some of the tradecraft that was probably associated with that, and then some things that you can do to protect your organization or some lessons learned that we can glean from that. So, we'll go ahead and get started. So I don't know if anybody on currently with us has read the blog, but we kind of have walked through this on the Reveal blog, where the first step, the attackers essentially gained access to GitHub. And, you know, there's a, in the article that we have on the blog that I penned, essentially, there's a joke on the red team side, like, you don't know what to do, check GitHub because the creds are always in GitHub. There's also good instructions on how to use things in the environment on Confluence. And those things definitely ring true. One thing about this in particular that was really interesting was that, once the attackers gained access to GitHub, they set persistence by making a user on the actual GitHub account for SalesLoft. And then they, basically preside in there for a long time. Now, there's not a lot of details to my knowledge, or at least at the time that we wrote the article, or that I've seen as of recent on how they got GitHub. But, we can make some good estimations, like credential spraying, old passwords, MFA fatigue, just general phishing, things like that. And once they had that access, there's probably a good amount of rummaging that went on, and the fact that they persisted for a while is also a pretty significant concern. So again, from my perspective on the red team side, and Clint, I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Once we're in the GitHub environment, we're in pillage mode. We're looking for anything that looks like a token. And I've seen some crazy stuff where like people have had passwords that have just been like base 64 encoded, and like, that's good enough. Let's just go ahead and store that in there. Even if it's for a dev environment, I mean, it's still juicy. I mean, what have
Right.
you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as a pen tester, especially on an internal team, you had access to, everybody's GitHub repo. And it was kind of essential for us to go through a team's GitHub repo that we were doing an engagement on. And as you said, the amount of information we found from that, running tools like Trufflehog. I know there's things like GitGuardian, but essentially, it's a treasure trove, if you will, of information, and it's not always visible, right? Like sometimes it could be in a diff that a developer realizes that they had some type of secret or token in there, and then they change up their code, but that's in the history, and you can find things in there. And in one of the engagements, I actually did find, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later. I found AWS credentials, and this was the AKIA, which is also in the Drift breach, where essentially that's the long-lived credentials. It's the
Hmm.
credentials, in this case, of the root user.
Oof.
So yeah, found the root user's credentials and was able to log into their account. And it was a little interesting because at that time, that person, I think when I first found them, or when this was first done like 3 years ago, they were just a developer, and at the time, 3 years later, they were a senior director. So how do you tell politely a senior director, hey, your credentials are out there? And of course, they worked 3 years later, which in some
Yeah.
respects that goes to this breach and the fact that there were these long-lived credentials, and that I think goes towards GitHub too, right? How do you authenticate to the GitHub? Personal access tokens, how long are they good for? And who's setting that in an enterprise environment? So it does tie directly back into the drift breach, but I thought that was an interesting engagement I was on.
Yeah, I mean I'm going to the next bump in the slide because we pretty much already jumped into that. But like that is crazy that there could, potentially have been, such long-lived tokens at such a root level. I mean, and that really kind of accentuates the, like as we're using, tooling like you called out, like Trufflehog and, other tools to try to find, juicy information within, the actual GitHub setup itself or wherever you're rummaging. Like I mean, that's something that, especially with like SaaS and with some things like GitHub and GitLab and things like that, like, who watches those things super closely? I mean, and from what I've seen personally in the field, and I know that there's been some maturity as, time has went on to protect some of these things like you called out, like GitGuardian. But like a lot of this stuff, like even now, I think that it kind of just exists. And we always had this joke, and I don't know if you heard the same joke, but like devs are gonna do dev things. Like and they live in like a different world, right? So they have SLAs and there's like, we have to get so much code pushed out and we've got to, reach version 2 or version 3 or version 4 of a product. And like, yes, there's a lot of pressure on them. And so sometimes they'll cut corners. I mean, there was instances like, I mean, there was one red team op I was on, I want to say that we were looking through the environment that we had gained access to. And once we had gotten into the environment, we discovered that it wasn't JBoss. I think it was like WebSphere or something like that that was running. And this guy's or gal's laptop, and it was running no authentication, just, obviously is root essentially on the box. And we got in and then we just like deployed, it was like our war file or whatever. And then we're on. And then because of the way it was set up, we were able to pivot from there into the environment. And they were an elevated user because they were a dev, for this one particular product. And then from there, we were able to just keep bouncing. And, it's just wild that those things can exist, but, never underestimate like the survivability of people, right? Like
Right.
I've got to meet this time frame. I've got to get out of here. I got to get this product out the door, or else, I'm not going to get my bonus, or I might not have my job. Like,
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's where we in security need to show that we're partnering with the dev
yes,
side. And we need to understand a bit about where they're coming from, right? Like they have to get something delivered on time. They have their sprints that they're doing. And I think, from the offensive side, we've all been guilty of doing the nuclear option of putting a payload in the temp directory, chmodding it or chmodding it
yep,
777, leaving artifacts on the box and being relatively sloppy. And I've done that in certification exams where you enable RDP on a Windows host
yeah,
with a guest user and you're just going nuclear and it's like how many artifacts are you leaving? But in this case it was pretty sophisticated. These threat actors were pretty good at obfuscating things, and I think we'll talk about it later, but some things gave them away, like Tor exit nodes and
mhm,
unique user agent strings. But that's what we talk about too in even when we're running tools, like if we're running nmap, with the nmap scripting engine, that's in the user agent string, right? And do people from the offensive side understand that the tools that they're running leaves these types of artifacts. So yeah, we're telling devs to be careful and to clean things up, but as attackers, are they doing those things? And what artifacts are they leaving?
Mhm.
So in this case, on both sides, the IOCs are there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think ultimately we want devs to know that we're working with them, we're on their side, and ultimately we want to be safe and prevent things like this from happening.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good call out, and we can jump right into the Tor stuff. I mean, that's super interesting, and it obviously correlates strongly to your background, the research you've done on the dark web. We were talking about this before we went live, and like red team stuff is cool, pen test stuff is cool, but like even CTI itself, like the folks that do the dark web like research, it's like whoa, like like
Yes.
you're a wizard.
Yeah, I mean that tour is an interesting thing, and having been on it and living in that world, there are some great things about it, and there's some not so great things about it. Obviously, threat actors live on there, and maybe we'll see this customer information pop up on the dark web or the deep web in some criminal forums, and I think that's still what we're trying to figure out about this breach is what's the intent of the threat actor. But ultimately, Exonerate Tor is a website that basically publishes all the IP addresses of all the Tor exit nodes. And that was
Nice.
a big IOC here was, hey, even for security teams, like you have upfront what are Tor exit nodes. And from the CTI's perspective, CTI teams should know this so that they're not allowing IP addresses from these Tor exit nodes to communicate with their infrastructure. And I think one of the companies Okta, I mean, that is ultimately why they were safe in this situation, is they did IP allow listing. So, and that's something from an architecture perspective too, from a security perspective,
Yeah.
is you want to create an allow list of which IP addresses are allowed to do anything in your environment. So whenever that option's available, take advantage of it because these threat actors don't want to be found out, and they will use VPNs, Tor exit
Mhm.
nodes to do their
Mhm.
malicious activity. They're not going to use their home IP address or shouldn't. Not that I haven't seen that bad type of OPSEC when I was on the dark web. That's how we got to arrest people. Is I remember in one case the marketplace I was on went down, and this guy actually sent an email from his home computer. I think it was called Safe Mail or Secure Mail or something like that. And it
Yeah.
had he was mailing me from his home IP address. And we were able to find him because his OPSEC was bad and his IP address came from his house.
Nice. Chef's kiss. Perfect.
Yeah,
These are the
right.
type of things we want to see as defenders, as threat hunters, not so much, from the adversarial simulation side. But
Sure.
uh, yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and like you said, like when we think about it from like the SaaS side and we think about like the security of, the misconfigurations, obviously there's like no detections, it seems like, in regards to GitHub. And there's ways that you can audit those things, but another interesting thing that kind of leading to this internal pivot is that, with GitHub now, you can do direct queries and searches. So like you can just look up like SSH. I mean, I'm not talking like it's just like a standard like you log in and you do that. Like they actually have a front end for it now, which is kind of wild. So, like there are definitely ways that we can lock that down. But it really blew my mind with the initial part, where they were saying the persistence and having accounts. I mean, that's pretty ballsy, right? For lack of better terms, like you're in there, you're in the environment, you feel safe enough to like set in an account. Like that seems like that should be like a really pretty loud, TTP
Right.
or pretty big signal flare.
And I joked about that too, right? Is like on those CTFs or whatever it might be, even setting that persistence mechanism of creating a new account, you'd think on the defender side, these are the types of bells and whistles that go off. So the ability to create this guest account and really not I mean, this really comes into inventorying, right? Is both your human identities and your non-human identities. And I think currently depends on the organization, but do organizations know how many non-human identities that they have? Because I would imagine, it's
Yeah,
10, 20, 30, 40 times more than the
yeah,
human identities. And who's cataloging that? Who's keeping track of
yep,
all these non-human identities, all of these OAuth tokens?
yeah,
And I know we talked about dev, or you mentioned dev briefly, but that seems like a blind spot that a lot of dev
Yeah.
teams don't think about, oh, it's just in dev, and I can be sloppy with these tokens, but I can tell you in the pen test world, what I saw often is they would set these OAuth tokens with like no expiration or a year expiration.
Yeah.
And you'd say, hey, like that's really bad security practice because if an attacker gains access to this token, until you revoke it, they can use this, or even in production, right? As you say, hey, this OAuth token is laying out there in GitHub, or we were able to intercept it somehow. Like you need to revoke it,
Yeah.
and like even there could be like a 90-day policy where a token is going to be revoked and in exchange for a new one. But what happens in those 90 days? Dev teams might think, hey, that token is going to be revoked, but really it works. And you say, hey, no, I was able to use this token, and they're like, well, we thought we revoked that. So they may not be familiar with the enterprise policy and practice.
Yeah.
So it's important on the server side to revoke these tokens. And I think ultimately that's what happened here, right? Is Salesforce said, hey, we need to revoke everything right now
Yeah.
because bad things are happening.
Yeah. Nuclear button. Yeah. Yeah. You're
Right.
exactly right about the dev tokens too, because I can't tell you the number of times that we have found something juicy like that. Like, I don't know, and like for like a dev environment setup that like could pull data for like Snowflake or something like that. I'm like, okay, well, okay, I don't really care about like the security controls as a red teamer that you've implemented for your production environment when I can literally just do it. Like another good example of that is like what you're saying is oh, we have jump boxes or bastion hosts or something like that. And then like they were very hastily set up as a compliance thing, as a checkbox thing. But then like once you're in, you realize that you can actually just go directly to the server. You don't need to use the jump box at all. Like, but it was there, and right, and that we've got a jump box. It's impossible. And you're like, well, if you see on the readout right here, like that actually didn't matter, you know? So yeah, I mean the long-lived tokens and stuff. And and then kind of keeping the train moving too with it is like as they pivot into the environment, they're in their AWS. I mean, from here, I mean that's a normal
Right.
group for a lot of folks. You've got all sorts of tricks, and there's so many AWS services and so many things that can be juicy, like the concept of things like role shopping and things like that that originated when AWS was first being rolled out is just like, of course, that's standard practice. I mean, you and I have experience with some high level breaches that, we're not going to go into detail, but like it was very impactful not locking down those roles and tackling things correctly, right? I mean, I'm sure
Right.
you've seen that too in pen tests.
Yeah, I have plenty of times, and I think that's kind of that rush to, just allow all when really now, from an architecture perspective, least privilege is so important. Zero trust is so important.
Yes.
These concepts that came from, unfortunately, these breaches where we have these overly permissive roles or, people just don't understand it fully. And I think I've heard times what, the difference between a good pen tester and a dev is that the pen tester reads one more page in the documentation than the dev does. So the pen tester understands a bit more than the dev does. But that's like, I'm just going to stand this thing up. I need to rush this thing to production,
Yeah.
and it's good. But I don't realize like on port 8888, there's some configuration endpoint with default credentials that allows all access to the server. So it's really important to understand your environment. And I think we talked about that too, right? Even as pen testers, could this have been discovered? Because right, this was a third party integration, and as pen
Yeah.
testers, we often have a defined scope. So
Mhm.
as pen testers, are we pen testing things like drift? Do we understand how that integration works? Because plenty of times you say, this is out of scope. I'm not going to consider this as a
Done.
potential attack vector. And in
Yeah.
this case, it was. So are we empowering our pen test teams to think outside the box? Are we contacting our SaaS vendors and ensuring that we are allowed to pen test them or get a copy of their pen test report? Do they have an internal pen test team that's doing stuff like this? Because a lot of time that's a blind spot, right? You talked about compliance. It's just a checkbox. So, I think this brings to light, our third-party integrations, how many we're using, how this is like 700 companies that were affected by this.
Yeah, it was a
And
ton.
did they all miss this, right? Did every single pen test team go, okay, well, this is not in scope, so
Yeah.
we're not gonna worry about it. But obviously, this is making us worry about it. And recently, I know different breach, but the NPM, supply chain, everyone's using
Yes.
NPM. that was a dev who was able to be phished, and we talk about defense in depth and human identities. He had MFA, and the attacker was able to bypass MFA. And I think I got an email from NPM yesterday that they're upgrading their security because of what happened. So
Yeah.
even MFA can be a weak point, right? So
Yeah.
that, I was just talking to somebody the other day about, using hardware-based tokens instead of these apps were supposed to be, the gold standard, but should
Yeah.
we be using hardware tokens or biometric authentication with MFA because it's much harder for attackers. So,
Yeah.
that's the thing with law enforcement, right? Is a war of attrition. Like they get smarter, we get smarter, and it just keeps going.
Yeah, that coevolution. And something you called out specifically about that, right? Kind of glossing a little bit over, now you're in AWS, there's a lot of cool tricks, that you can do. Say your role is limited to database, controls, and you figure out you can clone a production database, pull it down, run it locally per se, and then carve out creds. Like I've seen all that stuff in real time in the field, and it really depends on the creativity of the individual, like running the test or the op or doing whatever. So I mean there's a lot of really great stuff out there, but I wanted to say something too about the MFA thing is that people hear like, oh, MFA all the things, and you should, but
Absolutely.
with a star, right? Like anything, anything in moderation. Some things need to be, you have to think about where you do it, like because like for example, like I love YubiKeys, I use them personally, but OTPs, there's 100%. I've done this in live exercises where we were able to, speaking of the MFA thing, fish them, capture the YubiKey, cycle the YubiKeys in such a way that the user just thought that they like had fat fingered it the wrong way, and then like ran the YubiKey again. We put a timer in there. We gained our access, so we're in. Then they're in, right? Concurrent sessions. No optics on that because we live in a SaaS world, which is another thing that can be considered a misconfiguration. And then once we're in, we just silently add ourselves, to, oh, we have a Authy or something like that as like a secondary thing. And so now we have this back door into the network, and the user just literally saw one bump in the handshake to gain access. So like you said, even with MFA, there are ways to bypass that outside of just MFA fatigue, where you're just bombarding them, which that's a different thing entirely, which I'm sure you've probably seen, but it's pretty wild. I mean, it's a good control, right? But you have to think about it in like a thoughtful way, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, authentication is one part of this. And then we generate a bearer token, right? And if attacker's able to get the bearer token, MFA at that point doesn't matter, right? They
Yeah.
have the keys to the kingdom, and we can have this nice secure authentication with MFA set up. But, I remember in one engagement or just in one former employer that essentially, they were capturing things in a data lake, and there was a token or a cookie in there that you could replay that token and impersonate the user, even though there was all this fancy authentication MFA set up. So in this case, right, we can have that MFA set up, but if we have the keys of the kingdom, if we have those bearer tokens, um, we have access to the platform and API and can pull down data.
Yeah. Um, I know we're getting kind of close to time, so I wanted to keep track of that. But yeah, like you called out, I mean, it's not as clear cut in like the broad scoping of like tokens and things like that. Like even like in this example, like OAuth. I mean, I know that after they pillaged some of the data, one other thing that kind of came to light is it wasn't just the Salesforce instances, which obviously were super juicy and made the big headlines, but also afterwards they were gaining access to things like, VPN credentials, AWS secrets, things like that. So like there was a lot of really good fruit in that tree that they shook down once they gained that access. And that's unfortunately reality of it is once they're in, they're in. So um yeah, so I guess just kind of pivoting over to some of our Q&A stuff to see if we have any questions that have currently been listed. And I don't see anything in the live Q&A, but I know we had some that were submitted. This first one is, from an adversary's perspective, what was the single most critical misstep that enabled the Salesforce Drift breach, and how could organizations have realistically prevented it? Um, I've got my thoughts already on this one, but I'll let you take your first shot at this one.
I think we talked about this a bit, right? Cataloging your non-human identities,
Yep.
having an
Yep.
inventory of that. These long-lived tokens or credentials that,
Yep.
we should have short-lived tokens and credentials just because
Yeah.
of things like this. There was also something that I think the Okta CISO talked about, which is called Depop. I never heard of it. So there's demonstrating proof of possession, which is essentially um, validating that the token, when it's used, is coming from a specific client, right?
Oh
So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's not coming from, this Tor exit node, right? It's coming from the specific client, and that can mitigate these types of replay attacks where an attacker uses something. And I've seen this in guard duty too, right? Like in an engagement where you pull a credential down and you're in a Kali box and you try to use those, and then guard duty pops up and says, this is being used from Kali, right? Why
Yeah.
that triggers alerts, right? So those are a few of my thoughts, Matt, but I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, no, I'm with you. I was just kind of thinking about it as you're saying. I mean, for me, it's always goes back to the initial access. Like typically once the hardest part from like the red team adversary sim side is getting that foothold, that beachhead. And there's a lot of, I hope this works when you're sending out your phishing emails and your payloads because you work so hard on grooming everything to fit into the constraints of, what the rules of the engagement are, as well as getting that initial access. So, I mean, I just think about the GitHub side. Like, it just blows my
Right.
mind that they existed for so long. And so, I feel like detections, like you were saying, on identities, and then also detections on GitHub probably would have been, critical stopping aspects because, I mean, without that, I mean, they're still on the perimeter scrummaging, or rummaging for what they need. So,
Yeah, I think that point too, right? Like there are internal GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket repositories, but how many of these devs are unintentionally, ripping this code and putting it out there externally? Are enterprises aware? Do they have detections in place to see that their code is out there on public GitHub and not private GitHub? I've seen, rookie mistakes where people expose private keys instead of public keys. So, it's really that hygiene aspect that comes into play here.
yeah. There's another one. Why do defenders consistently miss detections in SaaS environments? And what immediate steps can blue team, like SOC, IR, etc., take to close those blind spots? I can take a first step at this one since you did the
Sure.
other one.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the problem with SaaS environments is that there's still a lot of institutional knowledge in regards to like understanding like what's a valid detection. We know in like, for example, Windows, we know with event IDs and things like that, like this is bad, like this is good, right? This person shouldn't be logging in or trying to RDP on this box, like domain admin shouldn't be trying to log in this particular fashion, things like that. We know those things, right? But when it comes to SaaS, like going back to that concurrent sessions comment, like it's normal for a user to have multiple sessions per se up, depending on the way that they work in the modern environment. And the whole like hybrid environment approach of work nowadays kind of underscores that. So I think that's probably why I think it's hard to do that effectively at scale. And there's it's hard to do it and it's hard to detect these things. And obviously there's approaches that you can take, but even then, if you were to have like a SIM and then you have created an alert, there's so many false positives you're going to get. You have to think about alert fatigue for your SOC analysts. So, what do you think, Glenn?
Yeah, I think that's why purple teaming is so important, right? Is
Yes.
our red and blue teams work together to create these types of detections. And this is a perfect case where we can learn from it and create these detections and see if our blue team's even able to detect it. But as kind of the overplayed saying, as attackers, we only have to be right once. Blue
Yep.
team has to be right every single time. So the
Yeah.
more that we drill this, the more that we learn from these types of breaches and put it into our playbooks, that's really the best we can do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good call. Well, I know we're getting close to the time marker. Clint, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, it's
Thanks, Matt.
a treasure trove of insight. Any other parting wisdom that you want to throw out there before we break?
No, thanks for having me on. These types of situations really are things that we can learn from. And I know I mentioned NPM as well, but we're learning all the time, and this is why it's so important to read the news, threat intelligence, things like that, and
Yeah.
integrate it into our environments because they're really all learning lessons. So the more we can learn from it, the safer we'll be. Thanks for having
Right.
me.
Appreciate it, brother. Have a good one. Thank
All
you,
right, easy,
everybody,
brother.
for
Take care.
joining. Bye.
Bye.
All right. And let's see if we got any other questions before we disconnect. I don't see any. So thanks everybody for joining. I hope that it was, fruitful and some good knowledge that was gleaned from it. And we should be having some more of these in the future. Oh, let me go ahead and bring back up the last slide here. Ah, there we go. And let's share. Just taking me a second there. Sorry about that. But yeah, as stated before, thank you for joining us. We'll hopefully have more of these in the future. And, we'll be tracking some of the other large breaches that have occurred. Appreciate everybody's time. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to myself. You can see we've got media@reveal.security that you can reach us if you have questions, comments, and then also check out Reveal Security and see what we have to offer. I know that we kind of touched on towards the end the SaaS security side. However, what we're working on here, I think, is a really cool solution that will fix some of the issues that we discussed today. And again, appreciate everybody's time.